Welcome to the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council with hosts Grace Evans and Moses Brattrud. Stay informed on the top stories on life, family, and religious freedom. Get the facts, stand for truth. Hi, and welcome back to the Family Beacon podcast. My name is Grace Evans. I'm here with Moses Brattrud. We have a lot to talk about today, right, Moses? We're going to be talking about critical race theory in Minnesota schools and how that is impacting children here in our state. It is something that is in our schools. We're going to explain why and how we can fight against that narrative. We're also going to be talking about something that just broke this week, right, Moses?
Yes, absolutely. We heard a little a murmur through the grapevine that when President Biden met with former President Obama last week, that he told President Obama that he was planning to run again. So that's the most official news, call it that, rumor, call it that, we've heard from the Biden camp that he was planning to run in 2024. Being the oldest president ever elected, there's been some speculation that he would step aside in favor of Vice President Kamala Harris or someone else and just run a kind of a one-term unity president type of a thing. That was the talk last year.
Did you believe that talk, Moses? I'd be interested to, what was your response, your initial reaction when you saw the headline, you know?
Yeah, well, my initial reaction is that Biden is saying to Democrats, he's saying internally to former President Obama and others, he's saying, I'm the only Democrat who can win in 2024. And the sad thing for the Democrats is that might be true. Like when you look at the top Democrats who got Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has twice failed to win the presidential nomination for the Democratic Party. So if he can't win his own party's nomination, he would have tough sledding in the general election. Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary for Transportation, also failed to win his party's primary. He's been a mover and a shaker within the Biden administration. He's got a lot of publicity, but he also failed to win the party's nomination. And I just don't think that he has the popularity numbers to beat Donald Trump or whoever the Republican nominee is in 2024. And finally, Vice President Kamala Harris has really had a rocky start to her tenure in the I think it's called the Naval Observatory where the vice president lives.
Is it really?
Yeah, I'll check.
I had
No. It's a mansion, but it's on the grounds of the Naval Observatory in D.C.
Suffice it to say, it has been a rocky run for her as vice president. I mean, I feel like I could say stuff. One thing, personal pet peeve that I just don't appreciate about Vice President Harris is that a lot of times when she's asked important questions like, "Can you comment on what's going on in Ukraine?" she just starts laughing.
I think
I don't appreciate that.
I don't appreciate it either. People have really attacked her for this. I don't think it's malicious. I really do think that it's just that she's nervous.
I agree. I think it is a nerve thing.
But
not
also
a good
not
look
showing
for
her
our country though.
Yeah, not showing her to her best advantage.
Yeah.
Did you see that clip of her where she was and I'm not going to be mean. Okay. There's the clip of her where she's talking about the significance of the passage of time. Did you see that?
No.
Oh, it's so
Wait, how
funny.
recent was this?
Oh, it was a couple weeks ago. And she just says the significance of the passage of time, like over and over again.
Yeah, there's a lot of clips like that. I mean, okay, to be fair, anyone could be. You can find dirt on anyone who's a public figure.
That's true.
I'm sure you can find a bunch of stuff on our podcast. Like, you could go back and be like, replay of one thing that we said.
Some dumb
that was,
moments, I'm sure.
Yeah, everyone has their blonde moment, so to speak. But yeah, that's just something that.
Except for Grace and I, because we have brown hair. So.
I mean, my hair was highlighted blonde when we started the podcast.
Was it?
Yeah, it was. But now I'm official
typical
brunette
man
again.
to have not noticed that.
Anyways, we are very much derailing already. So your initial reaction, though, Moses. So, were you surprised to hear this whisper from behind the grapevine? Were you surprised by that?
No, I think I always figured, health permitting, that President Biden would run again. It always makes sense for an incumbent president to run again.
Right.
Even Lyndon Johnson in 1968, who chose not to run again because the Vietnam War was so unpopular, then the nominee was, I think, Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, if I'm not mistaken, and he was beaten by Nixon. And after that happened, Johnson kind of was like, you know what, I should have run again. Incumbency is such a big advantage, even when you're a relatively unpopular president, like currently at this moment Joe Biden is. Barack Obama's approval ratings, for example, were in the negatives, but he
really
still won re-election in 2012.
I wonder if part of that, I was talking to a classmate about this, is, there's a lot of instability and uncertainty in America right now, like what direction our country is going, and also, moreover, what direction the world is going, and what's going to happen even with Ukraine and with NATO, like what's going to happen there.
Right.
I think there's a lot of confusion and a lot of different opinions, but a classmate was telling me that generally presidents tend to get reelected in a time of war, or either like you're on the verge of war. Not saying that we're about to get into a war, but there is a lot of uncertainty with everything going on in Ukraine. And so I wonder if, that uncertainty and the state of unrest, and I mean even just like inflation going so high, even though some people could argue, okay, well, this is an effect of President Biden's leadership. It might be, okay, well, we're in this uncertain time. We just want this unified, continued presidency for the sake of having the same face leading America rather than changing up the leadership.
Right.
I wonder if people are going to lean that way. I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts, Moses, because I know you follow elections pretty closely, and you usually have a good grasp on like who you think's going to win, and that usually comes to fruition. I'm wondering, I mean, it's so early to tell.
Yeah.
We don't even know who the Republican nominee is by any means, but what would you say right now? Like, what do you think President Biden's chances are of getting reelected, considering all things? I know it's far out, but what's your
let's say
reaction?
that he's against Donald Trump again.
Sure.
Now, being the incumbent is hard when there's something like a pandemic, and when we just saw what we saw in 2020, just the social unrest. And even though obviously Trump was not responsible for the pandemic or for the unrest that broke out in the summer of 2020. People were not, thrilled with the state of the nation at that moment. And so they were voting for change. So they were voting for Biden. But the thing is, of course, Biden was the ultimate establishment candidate.
And the media was very much against President Trump.
And the media was very against Trump. But then, so if we come to 2024, and let's say that it's Biden versus Trump rematch.
I really wonder what would go down there, honestly.
The thing is that Biden would have one significant disadvantage, because in 2020 he was able to say, I'm going to be the candidate of stability, of calm. I'm going to bring the nation together. I think that was one of his taglines or something similar. And, it turns out 2 years in, more or less, that President Biden's administration has not been any less divisive than President Trump's administration. And President Trump's administration was divisive. And so when President Biden can say he's the great uniter, then maybe he would have a good chance against Donald Trump. But if Donald Trump says, you and I both, for all our differences, the country was just as divided in the Biden presidency as in the Trump presidency, and for that matter during the Obama presidency, then I don't think that Biden has that playing card. I think he would struggle. I think the odds would still be on the incumbent, and he's beaten Trump once before. But if it was Trump versus Biden, I think it would be a real nail biter. I do not think it would be a landslide for either candidate.
Now, I do wonder if former President Trump would actually run again, because I know he said he will, but I'm wondering if he really will do that. And I'm also wondering how much support he really will garner from Republicans, conservatives, Christians. I'm really curious, honestly, because I don't know. I wonder how much of my personal opinion I should say on the podcast, because I do have personal opinions, but I wonder how much of a chance he really has.
The last poll I saw said that among Republican voters, President Trump would have 56% support to become the 2024 nominee
for the Republican
if
Party.
He chose to run again. And Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida was second with like 12 or 16%. So quite a difference.
Okay.
So President Trump absolutely, anything could happen.
Right.
He could choose not to run. If he chooses not to run, then the purpose of his murmurings where he says that he's going to run is that he would then be in a position to be a kingmaker, to choose the nominee, whether it's DeSantis or someone else.
I feel like then he would choose Candace Owens probably.
Oh, well, I don't think she'll run for president. I mean,
really? Because she has tweeted out a few times, but tweets are
so
tweets
has
at
Kanye
the same
West.
time. That's true.
I put those two people in a box.
Oh,
people
boy.
that I admire. I love Kanye West's music, but who I would not want to be running this country.
Well, we could talk this sort of politics all day. I feel like it's really interesting.
We can, yeah.
But I don't want to spend too much time talking about this, because I feel like it's hard to.
Can I say though, we're talking about critical race theory today, and it's very relevant because it is an election issue. right?
Yeah.
It's something that both parties are attempting to use in the 2022 election to get you to vote one way or the other. And so I think that's interesting. But let's talk about critical race theory. Why are we addressing this again? Why are we talking about this again now?
Yeah, so it keeps coming up, right? And what we hear a lot from mainstream media and progressives is that conservatives need to stop sounding the alarm that critical race theory is being taught in schools. It's not being taught in schools. What's being taught in schools is just general equity and respect of classmates and respect to people of color. That's what they're saying. So critical race theory is not being taught in schools. You guys need to sit down, chill out, and stop saying critical race theory is being taught in schools, because it's not. That's what we hear. That's what we hear all the time. One of my thoughts on that is, well, if you're a proponent of critical race theory, what's so bad about critical race theory being taught in public schools? Like, why are you trying to hide that it is being taught in public schools? That kind of concerns me.
Yeah, what they're kind of saying is like, it's
not a
critical
bad
race
thing.
Theory is not being taught in schools, but how wonderful would it be if it were?
Exactly, which is, it's interesting. And then I want to also say, it very clearly is being taught in schools, especially in Minnesota schools, and we're going to get into exactly the details of that. But before we dive into those details, I want to read you a quote by Ibram X. Kendi, which we have referenced before. He is a leading proponent of critical race theory. He's written a book called How to Be Anti-Racist. And many people cite him as, one of the leading faces of this movement. I want to read you a quote by him because this is fundamentally what critical race theory boils down to in a critical race theorist's own words. He says, quote, "The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination." So basically what he's saying, which is like a lot of words, right, is the only thing that we can do to solve discrimination that has happened in the past, racism that has happened in the past, is to discriminate in the future and in the present. That is at its core what critical race theory is purporting. That is what they're upholding. And we can talk this jargon of equality and equal rights all day, but ultimately this is what a leading figure of critical race theory is saying critical race theory is about. So I want you to keep that in your heads as we go out throughout this episode, and we're going to eventually show how critical race theory is being taught in schools and how critical race theory is upholding this idea of discrimination being the only solution that we can come to. Right. With that being said, Moses, do you have any other thoughts on why it's so important that we're talking about this right now?
Yeah, so first of all, I get so sick of seeing liberals, progressives saying conservatives, A, don't understand critical race theory, and B, don't, and so they don't understand that what they're talking about is something that barely exists and is certainly not being taught in elementary school. So first they're saying that, and then, as I said, they say, but if it were taught, that would be just such a wonderful thing. But the thing is, it doesn't matter what term you use. You can play games with terminology all you want. And that's what someone like Ibram Kendi is doing. I'm not sure if he would even call himself someone who espouses quote-unquote critical race theory. I assume he would, but I don't know. His preferred term is anti-racism, How to Be an Anti-Racist. That's his book, which I did read. And I actually recommend it to anyone who... I think it is one of the most clear, that along with Robin DiAngelo's book,
White Fragility,
which both of us have read as well. You really just, if you read those two books, you will understand so much of what's going on and what is being taught in schools. And we're talking about it again in part because, well, we had a recent news event that we'll talk about here in Minneapolis, but also there continues to be a misunderstanding. There's conservatives are, and you know what, we should go the other way too. We should say that conservatives do get this wrong. Okay.
Oh, definitely.
If kids are being taught that racism is bad and that Martin Luther King Jr. did something good and important when he did the March on Washington, that's good.
Everyone should get behind that.
Everyone should be taught that.
Yep.
I was taught that in my private Christian school back in the 90s.
So was I.
Way before critical race theory was a thing, right? So it
was a thing. It just wasn't as pervasive.
That's true. Yeah, it was not being taught in elementary schools.
Right.
Certainly not under that word, under that term. So we can be careful. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's good to teach kids that all the races are equal, that they were all made by God. So send your kids to Christian school, as opposed to being taught that they're made by evolution. or meaningless chance over billions of years, whatever they say, created your children in the public schools.
We want to affirm the dignity of each individual. A recent headline concerning something that happened recently, I think this was on April 19th. Yeah. Can you kind of explain what went down?
So we have 2 Minneapolis schools that were renamed. And, I really think that when this happens, it should be a really long and well thought out process. I'm totally in favor. Before the podcast, Grace is like, if there's Lake Hitler, I'm totally in favor of renaming that, which I thought was a funny line.
Is that my voice?
That I had to steal, and then no, that's not your voice.
Okay, thank you.
But yeah,
if something's called like Hitler Academy, of course I want that renamed. Yeah,
that's
a really good point. Am I right? So right. Why don't we? Okay, so explain the situation. Explain what's going on, and then we'll explain our response.
Yeah. So we had 2 schools here: Sheridan Dual Language Elementary and Jefferson Global Studies and Humanities Magnet School. Now, Sheridan, that's named after Philip Sheridan, a Civil War general. I don't really know much about him, so I'm going to pass over him for now. But Jefferson School, obviously, that's named after Thomas Jefferson. So that's going to be named Ella Baker School after Ella Baker, an African-American civil rights activist. And that was chosen by the students.
And she did amazing things for the civil rights movement. Like, I looked into her really great stuff. Everyone has flaws, but the work she did to fight for equality was amazing.
Right. So like, we're not against Ella Baker. That's not what this is about. We're not against the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was good and important.
Absolutely.
You're hearing us say that, okay?
Yeah.
But so the question is, what does it mean to take Thomas Jefferson's name off of the school? What does Jefferson mean? Now, for us as Christians, we don't love Jefferson. Jefferson famously took the Bible, and he literally took a scissors or a knife or whatever, and he cut out the parts he didn't like. So as Christians, we're not okay with that. We don't like that. Now, do we want to take Thomas Jefferson's...
and he also owned slaves, which is something that people cite a lot.
Yeah, which is much worse.
And of course, we're not getting behind that. Like, we fully condemn that. That's what Moses and I are getting at.
Right. What I'm trying to do is I am trying to separate the man and his personal actions from his legacy, because his legacy was arguably not that of a slave owner or a religious crackpot, which he was. He also didn't treat his slaves very well, even for a slave owner.
Perhaps we're separating the man from the legacy that he created for America, not so much his personal legacy.
Right. So that's the thing. What else did Thomas Jefferson do other than mistreat his slaves? Well, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. It's an important document, not just to this country, but to world history. Like, it's not going too far to say that if you were, let's say you're coming in from another country, if you have the freedom to do whatever you want in a free country and vote for the leaders that you want, then that was influenced by Thomas Jefferson and the founders of this country, who wrote the Declaration of Independence and later the Constitution, and enshrined those values into this country's DNA. Thomas Jefferson, in that sense, transcends any historical milieu. He transcends his own time, his own flaws, and he becomes a figure that all of humanity can celebrate, because all of us, those of us who live in free nations, we are able to, we are only benefiting from Jefferson at this point, right? Like, Thomas Jefferson's negative legacy, it didn't die out with him, but it had a much smaller effect. Do you see what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying.
His positive legacy.
So he wrote in the Declaration of Independence, he wrote that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he wrote these beautiful principles that we absolutely should uphold.
Yeah.
The problem is that he didn't uphold these principles. Clearly, he owned slaves. So he was not upholding his core belief that all men are created equal and that they're endowed with certain rights. He did not uphold that belief.
Right.
But the principles that America were founded on, one of them being this principle, that every man is created equal, is a good principle, and we should return to those principles and uphold those principles, because those are good. And when those principles are when we hold to those principles, we see America flourish. When we hold to the belief that that each person, regardless of skin color, is worthy and deserves respect and is equal in God's sight and in the sight of everyone, that's when America thrives. And so I think that's what Moses is getting at here, is he didn't uphold that in his personal life, but what he wrote and what has shaped America is a good thing. Those principles are good,
That's
undeniably
right.
so. I don't think anyone, even progressives, would deny that principle of all men being created equal and deserving these rights is wrong.
Right. I think the question is, can we celebrate the founding principles of this country even though the founding fathers were hypocrites?
Right.
Even though they, as Grace said, did not truly uphold the equality and dignity of all mankind, even if it took a bloody war for our nation and then years of Jim Crow segregation and finally the civil rights movement to really truly affirm that all men were actually created by God with dignity and were equal before the law.
Yeah.
So it took our country time to do that, but does that mean that those truths and even the founding documents and the founders themselves should be cast out or canceled? I think not. I'm not always going to be against changing something's name. You know, we had this discussion before we got on the air today, but ultimately I think it's a good thing. It's not oppressive to the kids in Minneapolis to go to a school named after Thomas Jefferson. I think it reminds them that flawed people like Thomas Jefferson can do great things, like writing the Declaration of Independence. And I just don't see what the problem with that is. And when you in fact change something, if you want to start a new school and name it after Ella Baker, I'm totally in favor of that. But when you're taking Jefferson's name off of something, then you are deprivileging, to use the woke terminology, but you're deprivileging and decentering.
Exactly, we're decentering whiteness.
Jeffersonian, no, you're decentering democracy, which is a colorblind concept which we all enjoy. But anyway, so that's my soapbox for that.
I want you to read your statement though here about Jeffersonian democracy, because I think that is good.
Oh,
I want you to read that.
What I was thinking is like this concept that we've all benefited from is uncancelable. You can't take away people's right to freedom and self-determination, which, you know, arguably Americans were the first people to give that to themselves. English common law is close second, but this is even before the French Revolution, and the French tried to do the same thing and failed in their typically French fashion. And so Jeffersonian democracy is uncancelable. The man was deeply flawed, but we have all benefited from the concepts that he and the other founders put into this country's DNA. So that's my final word on that. But I want to say to the people who claim, as the Star Tribune did last summer, that a critical race theory is not being taught in Minnesota. So at the time, I responded with a letter to the editor, which was published, saying, well, here's several examples, including one from your own paper, of teachers talking about how they integrate the concepts of critical race theory into their pedagogy, into their curriculum. Now, one thing that I found while we were researching for this episode is that there's actually the governor's strategic plan for the state of Minnesota, for the Minnesota Department of Education, actually includes language that is straight from the critical race theory playbook. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Let's talk a little bit about that. So during COVID and in the wake of the first wave of COVID, this was in 2020, the governor got together with some key educators here in Minnesota, and they decided to come together and try to, this was after the tragic events of George Floyd and everything that happened there in Minneapolis, and they got together and tried to figure out what an educational plan should look like coming forward and coming out of this. And so I want to read you just their introduction, because I want you to just understand where they're coming from, and then I'm going to read some other key quotes and we'll talk about what they mean. But this is kind of their vision. This is the reason why the governor got together with why he got together with educators to come to a conclusion of how they should proceed with education. So I'm reading this from the 2020 Governor's Education Roundtable report, and this will be linked in the show notes. It states, for far too long, inequities have existed for some students and families. The pandemic and the tragic death of George Floyd have exacerbated and shed a light on the inequities facing our Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. In order to ensure each and every student has a world-class education, we have to address and push back on beliefs, historical practices, policies, and educational delivery models that have created barriers to the success of some students and families. We have an obligation to provide every student, regardless of whether they live in the metro area or greater Minnesota, with an educational experience that values who they are and supports them to reach their highest potential. Now, let's take that quote. That's the introduction. Initial thoughts on that, Moses, on that quote.
So I really disliked the first bit, talking about the inequities facing our Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. That's classic race-based thinking, where the only real inequities that people face are based on race and sexuality. The first thing I thought of was, I've been to a lot of different parts of Minnesota that are pretty poor and very white, and so do those kids matter? Do they deserve to have an education, or do inequities only face Black, Brown, and Indigenous students? Now, to be fair, in the last sentence they talk about geographic inequity, metro area, greater Minnesota, but I still think just the focus on race, as if race is the biggest problem facing Minnesota students, their race or someone else's race, is I just think that's the wrong place to start.
It's the wrong mindset. Yeah. I think what for me, what they said about, having an obligation to provide every student with educational experiences that values who they are and supports them to reach their highest potential. That is something absolutely that MFC can get behind, that Moses and I will get behind. We are definitely proponents of that. I'll get more into that later and exactly what we mean by that. But that's something that everyone should support. This intro sounds very compelling and very good, because it makes you want to get behind that and I want to support children that have been underprivileged, and I want to make sure that they can have a good education. And so I think it's deceptive in a way, because when you get more into this roundtable, there are some other things that at the beginning, the quote I read about Ibram X. Kendi stating that the only way to remedy racist discrimination, which has existed, there has been racist discrimination in our country in the past, more prevalently in the past, it still does exist today. There is still racism that exists. But he says that the only way to resolve that is to continue discrimination.
Right.
Now, I want to read you, there's different ways in which this roundtable seeks to uphold this vision that they have set before them of providing every student with high potentials of education. And one of the things that they desire to do is, quote, whiteness needs to be decentered in the curriculum, and the experiences and contributions of people of color need to be emphasized, so students of color and American Indian students are affirmed, more engaged, and fully educated. Now, here's where I think we start to see more of the discrimination language. They're not saying discrimination at all, but what they are saying is that whiteness needs to be decentered in the curriculum, and the experiences of Black people need to be elevated. Now, it does seem... Here, Moses, I'm gonna let you respond to this, because I have a thought and I have a quote that I want to read, but I think you have a...
I just think that we're coming about this the wrong way. If I stood up at a school board meeting and said, I really want the curriculum to center the experiences of my white ancestors and to center my white children, and really consider their feelings before we talk about the feelings and thoughts of the Black, Brown, and Indigenous students. What would people say? They would say that I'm a racist, and that would be correct. If I'm privileging someone's feelings or views because of their skin color or racial attributes, then I am being racist. It isn't that complicated, but we're trying to, our opponents in this on this issue are trying to redefine racism to mean something different, and this idea of whiteness being decentered, I just think is so interesting. I think it's just what does that mean? What does that mean other than...
tangibly mean?
And I wanted to talk about this later, but I think it's so relevant now. Last fall in Roseville, there was a school board meeting that was contentious because of, I think, some school curriculum that delved into critical race theory was being discussed. And there was one mom who stood up, an African-American mom. I think she was an attorney. And I'd love to meet her.
Yeah. We should roll that clip.
Yeah. We'll roll that clip now. You could take a look.
I'm here to ask the district to stop promoting critical race theory and Black Lives Matter. People who support CRT say people like me and people who are against CRT are racist. That's their only defense. Yet CRT is racist. It tells kids of color like my children that they will never be able to make it, and white kids that they are inherently racist.
So in that clip, Grace, I just love what that mom had to say. She's saying that critical race theory is bad for white kids and it's bad for Black kids. It's bad for her kids. It tells her kids that they will never measure up. And that's even if there's some type of reparations or whatever it is that critical race theorists want. And it tells white kids that they're inherently oppressive. They're oppressive not because of their actions, which they can change, but because of their skin color, which they can't. It's ineluctable. And so I just think that's a particularly horrifying thing to teach the children. So tell us more about this roadmap. Is this something that's actually going to be put into practice?
So it's actually something that's already being practiced
my goodness.
Yeah, in education in Minnesota schools.
Yeah.
So that's something, if you go on to the Minnesota Department of Public Health, or Department of Education website, you see that it is actually already in effect in public schools. And I'm not sure to what extent exactly this means, because this is a very generalized vision of,
these are their goals.
These are their
for
goals.
The state,
like one of their other goals.
For every public schools. It doesn't mean that all public schools are going to be the same.
One of their other goals is to pass legislation while changing local policies and practices to increase the percentage of teachers of color. Another is to hold schools, teacher preparation programs, institutions accountable for being anti-racist and ensuring...
There's that term.
Yep. And ensuring accountability is to communities of color and American Indian communities. So they have a lot of these goals and things that is being implemented, but I think that the way specifically it's implemented is left up to the districts and to school boards and things like that. So it's going to vary from school to school, but in general, this is the vision that the governor has set forward starting in 2020. And the general vision, the starting point vision of that stated all students should have the opportunity to learn in beautiful and inspiring facilities that nurture and challenge the mind while protecting the safety of students. That one sentence, if you take that out of everything else that they're saying, putting children into boxes of oppression. Some children are repressed and some children aren't. If you take it out of that box, what we would find is that we agree. Moses and I fully support all students having opportunities to be educated in the best way possible, in a place where they're nurtured and their mind can grow to its fullest extent. Here's what we have to say about that, though, is I think the best way for children to be able to pursue that is for the funding to follow children to whatever school they choose. In Minnesota,
Bam!
In Minnesota, I've been waiting the whole episode to say this because I'm so passionate about this. In Minnesota, funding does not follow students, and it is tragic and disheartening that people would ever oppose this. Like, who wants to oppose funding our taxpayer dollars not following our children in the schools that best support them in their educational learning? Like, if there are certain schools, and there are certain schools in Minnesota that are terrible, especially, there's just a lot of things that go on. They're not good schools. Shouldn't children be allowed to pull out to go to a school in a different district or go to a private school, a charter school, wherever is best for them, and then that funding that their parents already pay to the government, their tax money, just follows them? That's so logical to me. I don't see why anyone would disagree with that, honestly.
Let me take this from the perspective of a parent, because my daughter is 2.5, going to be 3. So we're thinking about preschool. We're thinking about, kindergarten in a few years. And the thought is, and we're having this discussion, like, can we afford to put this, this amount of our income into private school for Mary, or that's my daughter's name, or do we need to homeschool, or what are our options? Public school is just not on the table for us, and many parents have come to that point. Like, this is not going to be if you ultimately. And this is why school board elections were so contentious last fall, and they're going to be again this fall, because parents want to have some measure of control over what happens in public schools. And they do. Parents and other voters can vote out school board officials who are teaching critical race theory or injecting that into the curriculum. Absolutely. Now, of course, that depends. You may not be able to do that. What you certainly can do is take your kid out of that school and find a better option. And what Grace is saying, and this is, I just think, so commonsensical.
Yeah, it's so common sense.
Yeah.
The funding should follow the children.
Yeah, absolutely.
Clearly.
Absolutely. So I think as a parent, So this is something that Minnesota Family Council has been pushing at the legislature in more or less this form for years, and we will continue to push. And what we need for this to happen is for there to be majorities in both houses and a governor who, well, Governor Walz is a former teachers union member, a former teacher.
That's not surprising to me.
It isn't surprising, and I think it explains a little bit of his attitude toward Minnesotans. And I also think that he knows which side his bread is buttered on, as they say, and he's not going to do something that would take power away from the unions and from the public schools, which is what school choice would do. And I think when people talk about school choice, and they think it benefits rich white people, what's wrong with them? But it actually does not. It would the most benefit would be for people for minority students who tend to live in some of the worst performing school districts. So if you are a minority parent and you don't have a ton of spare income, then the local public school might be your only option. However, and there are charter schools, but those charter schools, the quality is not always there as well. And ultimately, there's barriers, there's hurdles. And so when if the funding were to follow the student, then the state would say this amount of money is the cost of educating a child per year. And we will give that as a credit to a family seeking to put their kid into education. And whatever school offered an education in that area for that student would be open to them. So a high-performing student could go to a private school that their parents would not be able to afford, that wouldn't necessarily be able to admit them otherwise with that fund. And then special needs students would be able to go to maybe a special school that serves special needs students, because that is one thing that people say, that public schools are really good at serving special needs students, which I hope is true. But the point is, we're not calling for the abolishment of public schools. We're calling for public schools to face the free market in the sense that, like in healthcare.
That's good.
in healthcare, if you're a veteran, let's say, you can go and you can get government healthcare. You can go to the VA hospital, or
that's why Medicare,
or Medicare. But in the VA is literally run by the government. They're all government employees. But as a veteran, you may also choose to go to a private hospital, and you may need to have supplementary insurance for that. And many veterans do. That's the thing. Even though the VA, I think, is either free or very low cost if you're a veteran. So it's just that's what we're calling for, not the abolishment of public schools, but if you are seeing critical race theory in your child's school, your best option is to take your kid out and put them in private school immediately. And then what you do with us is help us work to so that school funding would follow the child rather than being put into the same old failing systems.
Right. So besides following MFC's efforts to increase children's opportunities and to allow funding to follow children, there are other things that we can support. There is a way forward here in Minnesota. I recently met a representative from Take Charge Minnesota at an event that we were at, that MFC was at.
Oh, cool.
And we just started talking about Take Charge Minnesota, and I was like, oh, this is really cool. I want to just let you know what this organization is about and what their vision is for an America where, yes, racism exists, but it is not, they would say that it is not systemic. It exists, but it's not systemic. And so their vision is they say, while forces attempt to divide the country by race, class, and gender and assign people into groups, Take Charge Minnesota forges a different path by empowering people to take charge of their lives and not depend on a group, agency, or government for their well-being. Take Charge Minnesota strives to unite Americans regardless of background towards a shared history and common set of beliefs. We celebrate the successes of all who have achieved the American dream while encouraging people still working to achieve it. So this is just directly from their website. Their mission is to inspire and educate Black and other minority communities to their full rights and privileges as American citizens, and that these privileges are granted to them by the Constitution. They say that they desire to inspire minorities to take charge of their own lives and the lives of their children, not to not believe the lies and the myths that are being perpetuated by progressives. They believe that a well-grounded knowledge of American world history strengthens their diverse our diverse country, I should say. Which this is just an amazing organization, I have to say.
Yeah.
The best thing, one of their main points is that the best thing for minority children is not to teach them that they can't achieve the same things as white children, or that they're inhibited from achieving the same things as white children by things that have happened in America's past, but rather to give them the option to opt out of bad schools and have the funding follow them to better ones. And
Right.
the answer to racism isn't more discrimination, like Ibram X. Kendi argued. The answer is forgiveness for the past. And so the CEO, I believe, or president, I think he now isn't, because he's running for governor, Kendall Walz, but I think his wife is now the CEO or chair, whoever the top person is. But anyways, he recently did an article, which was amazing. He wrote an article on just his vision. So here's a quote from Kendall Walz. He said, "As we forgive the country for the sins of slavery, Jim Crow laws, and many other forms of bigotry that followed, the heavy burden of bitterness, anger, and resentment will be lifted from our shoulders. Our eyes will be opened so that we can clearly see the path forward, allowing us to focus on what is best for our future and the future of our children." And I think that's just really beautiful. It's so unifying and so true that we can't hold on to the bitterness of the past. And I think it's easy for me to say as a white woman. It's easy for me to say, don't hold on to the bitterness of the past, but it's not something that I'm saying. It's something that a black person is saying. He's saying this to fuel this narrative of division that we just see CRT perpetuating. This discrimination is the answer. He's saying discrimination isn't the answer. Actually, forgiveness is the answer. And I think that's a beautiful vision.
I think, and I think if we don't necessarily think that the nation treated our ancestors really terribly, let's say, maybe we do. Many people have had negative experiences. It's not just based on race.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you have a relative who died in the Vietnam War or the Iraq War, and you blame the government for that, and you have bitterness for that. Or maybe you're bitter against a family member or anything like that. Wherever there is bitterness, anger, and malice, that is where we need forgiveness. And Kenneth Walz is exactly right to say that we need that in terms of race relations in this country and the many sins and mistakes that this country has made, and the people who are understandably bitter about that. But that doesn't justify bitterness, because bitterness is sinful. And so I guess my final note is, wherever we are, whatever we're facing, there's things that we're probably bitter, angry, and resentful about. And we talked last week about Easter, and the power of the resurrection of Jesus is that we are forgiven by God for our sins. But it is not just, it doesn't end there. It's so that we can go and then forgive our brothers and sisters. And so that's the call. We are called to forgive, to let the weight of sin fall away. And I guess that's maybe my biggest problem with critical race theory, is that there's no place for the gospel of forgiveness.
Definitely not. That's my biggest problem. It's such a detriment to the gospel. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's just there isn't salvation in critical race theory.
Right.
There's no solution, really. The only solution is to perpetuate the cycle of discrimination.
Absolutely.
Right? So there's no, things will get better because suddenly there won't be people that are racist. No, everyone's still going to be racist. You can just be anti-racist, but every white person will still be racist regardless of what they do. There's no salvation for them. So it definitely is detrimental to the Christian faith, and it's saddening to see so many Christians embracing something that teaches such division when we're all unified under the gospel.
That's a good point. Many people, including Christians, think that this is really good, that this is the way forward, because it deals with these things that really happened, these wrongs that were really committed. But I think, going back to that Ibram Kendi quote, the only remedy for historic discrimination is current discrimination. And
future discrimination.
Yeah, and it's just I just want to say that's false. What the gospel tells us is that if people have been unequally treated in the past, that there should be forgiveness, and forgiveness then leads to equal treatment in the future. So on this week after Easter, I guess my main message here, I think our main message, is that don't give into a false gospel that tells you that you are inferior because of your skin color, or that other people are worse or better than you because of your skin color, or that you're being oppressed because of your skin color. Because what we need to do is focus on how can we lay our lives down and follow Jesus? How can we forgive others? How can we practice the golden rule? And that's the way that I hope, I pray, can build a better society rather than the politics of grievance and resentment, which is the only thing that critical race theory offers us. So that's the final word from the Fortress of Sanctitude here at the Family Beacon podcast. I'm Moses Brattrud with Grace Evans. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Remember, if you are on iTunes, give us a 5-star review so that other people see this. If you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. We will see you next week.
Thanks for listening to or watching this episode of the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you're up to date on life, family, and religious freedom. You can follow us on Instagram at MN Family Council and subscribe to us on YouTube to watch our content. Get the facts, stand for truth.